The newer words in the dictionary is the word humble brag. Have you ever heard of the term humble brag? That's kind of a newer thing. Do you know what a humble brag is? Let me read you the dictionary definition. Actually, when I was thinking about this, I decided to Google it, and I couldn't believe it. It came up under the internet-based Merriam-Webster dictionary, and here's humble brag. All right, it's a verb. Just to sound technical here. Okay, we're going with the part of speech. It's a verb. To make a seemingly modest, self-critical, or casual statement or reference that is meant to draw attention to one's admirable or impressive qualities or achievements. Humble brag, all right? For instance, you could say, I accidentally brought $3,000 with me to buy a pair of shoes. I'm just terrible with prices. What am I doing? Well, I'm bragging about how much money I have, right? Okay, I'm not really talking about how terrible I am with prices. I'm bragging about, I haven't really done that, okay? But that's what a humble brag is. It's kind of it's really a social media thing, like the inevitable girl posting the selfie says, forgot to put my makeup on, and she's fishing for everybody to say, oh, you look so good without your makeup, right? It's called a humble brag, all right? Well, anyway, I want to introduce you to a champion humble bragger, and this guy is a Pharisee. Jesus tells us about him. And we're going to find that the Pharisee's main problem, the thing that drove him to be a humble bragger, was the fact that he was self-righteous. All right? And we're not surprised when we hear that a Pharisee is self-righteous. But the problem of self-righteousness is much more common than just being something that a group of Jewish men did 2,000 years ago and we heard about in the New Testament. It's much more common than that. In fact, self-righteousness is alive and well in America today. In fact, I believe it's a worldwide problem, but we find it in America today, and we find it in churches, and many times we find it when we look in the mirror. And so his problem was being self-righteous. What does self-righteousness do to a person? What is the fruit of that in his life? But before we're going to get to that, what is a self-righteous person? Well, a self-righteous person, isn't that anybody that has higher personal standards than you, right? That's what it is. A Pharisee is somebody that has more scruples about some particular area of life than I do, right? No, all right? That's not necessarily what a Pharisee is or a self-righteous person is. Self-righteousness is simply believing that you are good enough for God. It is believing that God owes it to you to bless you and take you to heaven. That's what self-righteousness is. It is believing that your righteousness is so good in God's eyes that He will accept your righteousness as acceptable to Him, as holy enough to be accepted in His presence as one of His children, and that's it. That's self-righteousness. What causes self-righteousness? Well, self-righteousness is caused by gross ignorance of God's righteousness. A person who truly understands God's righteousness will not be self-righteous. God's righteousness is the highest standard. His thoughts even are above our thoughts. But listen to what the Apostle Paul writes about his countrymen, Israel, the people from whom the Pharisees came. Romans chapter 10 and verse 1 through 3, Paul describes their attitude of self-righteousness. Look at this. He says, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God." Did you catch how many times Paul said righteousness right there? All right, here's a group of people. Paul says, listen, by the way, Paul finds some self-righteous people, and he doesn't get the torches and the pitchforks and go out to get them, right? He says, I'm burdened for these people. My prayer to God is that they will be saved, and Paul really lived that. He would go into a city and preach the gospel. They would stone him, drag him out, leave him for dead, and when he somehow was able to recover from that, stand up and walk, he went right back into that city. Stephen had the same mindset when he preached to the Jews, and they stoned him with stones, and he was falling down and said, Father, forgive them. He said, I see Jesus standing on the right hand of God. He was preaching the righteousness of God. Why? Because he, like Paul, was burdened for his self-righteous countrymen. Well, they are self-righteous because the Bible says here, hey, they have a zeal for God. They want to be right with God, but it's not according to knowledge. They're ignorant of God's righteousness. How do people become ignorant of God's righteousness? Hang on a minute. Pause for a water break. People become ignorant of God's righteousness by basically assigning their own imagination as the standard of righteousness. Basically saying, here's what I can imagine righteousness to be, so that must be what God's righteousness is. Instead of going to God and finding out what it is, going to the Word of God and saying, well, God, what is your standard of righteousness? They say, well, I'm a pretty good guy. You've talked to people who are self-righteous. If you've ever witnessed to people, you will find them. And you say, well, here is what the Bible says. All men have sinned. All men have come short of the glory of God, but God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. The wages of sin is death. You explain all these things to them and get through all that and get to the point where you ask them, would you like to receive Jesus Christ as your Savior? And at that point they say, yeah, I'm good enough. I'm okay. I got it. What is that? That is self-righteousness. And a lot of times, I think most times, they just don't understand the righteousness of God. It hasn't really dawned on them yet. And that is the Jewish people in Paul's day. He says they are ignorant of God's righteousness, going about to establish their own righteousness. And here is the problem. They have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. There was a day, hopefully in your life, I believe so, a day in your life when you submitted yourself to the righteousness of God. You said, God, I am going to turn away from my own righteousness. I'm not going to try and work my way into heaven or try to put you in my debt through works, but I am going to turn from that, and you receive Jesus Christ as your Savior. That was submitting to the righteousness of God. Only Jesus could make you righteous. Paul did that. In Philippians chapter 3 and verse 9, he said, I want to be found in Him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith. True righteousness comes by faith, and it comes from God. Abraham believed in the Lord in Genesis 15 and verse 6, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Abraham, the father of our faith, really, in the lineage of things. And then Romans chapter 4, and Paul is recounting that Genesis account, and he says in Romans chapter 4 and verse 3, for what saith the Scriptures, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. Now to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but debt. See that? If we work for our salvation, God is in our debt. For instance, it's kind of like if you go to work and on Friday is payday, you go to work every day, does your boss owe you a paycheck? Yes, all right? You worked. They owe you a paycheck. If they don't pay you, you can sue them, all right? Legally. You can go after them because they owe you that. They're in your debt. You worked. And here's Paul talking about Abraham and saying, that's not how salvation works. You don't do something good and put God in your debt to where He owes you salvation. God owes us nothing. He gives us salvation by grace, and that's the next verse. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. And so, being not ignorant of God's righteousness, realizing I can never attain to that level of holiness and righteousness on my own, I submitted to the righteousness of God through Christ by faith, and God justified me. How do I know God justified me? Because it says right there that God justifies the ungodly. That was me. And that's what he does. 2 Corinthians 5:21 tells us how he did that. But he made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made what? The righteousness of God in him. True righteousness then comes by faith. And by faith we trust in Jesus Christ and receive his righteousness. And then God, at that point, justifies us. He justifies us. He pronounces us to be righteous. In his court, God finds us not guilty of sin, but finds us righteous. And this is based entirely on the merit of Jesus Christ on our behalf, received by faith. Now, there are many people who trust in their own righteousness. Here in America, here in this town, people you know, people I know. And here's what I am tempted to think. Oh, they're pretty good. They're okay. Not too much danger there, because they're pretty good people. I don't know if you're tempted the same way, but it makes me sleep better at night. All right? Just being transparent with you, all right? But the truth is, many people trust in their own righteousness. They trust in going to church. They trust in the fact that we live in America, and America seems like a nice country. I mean, we have all kinds of freedom. It is the most blessed country ever. We've got all kinds of nice infrastructure. It's very civilized as far as countries go in this world. I mean, those of you that have been overseas, you know how the difference. It's just such an amazing place. And people get comfortable in that and think we're okay with God. People trust in being American. People trust in many, many things. And Jesus, in infinite mercy, confronts those people and offers them the truthful rebuke that they need. And he did that here with the Pharisees. And we're going to look in Luke chapter 18, and we're going to find this in Luke chapter 18, this world champion humble bragger. And this guy is so good at humble bragging, he will do it to God. He will brag to God about himself. That is some serious self-righteousness, all right? He'll do it loudly so everybody can hear him. And let everybody know what he thinks of himself. Luke chapter 18, verse 9, all right? And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. There's the self-righteousness, all right? They trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up, here's the parable. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. What a great guy, huh? We read the next prayer. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified. There's that word, right? Justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. What does self-righteousness do? What is the fruit of that in our lives? Jesus has been telling short stories with timeless truths, and we've been examining those parables in the Gospel of Luke that are unique to the Gospel of Luke. And in this occasion, and we're gonna break these down into familiar familiar sections here. There's an occasion for the story. We'll look at that, and then we're going to examine this short story and find the timeless truth in that short story. And in doing that, we're going to see what the fruit of self-righteousness is. What does it do? What does it cause you to do? Well, first of all, self-righteousness will cause you to despise others. It'll cause you to look down on other people. A self-righteous person has no problem with looking. Now, he doesn't necessarily look down on everybody, but he will find people that he can look down on. Here's the occasion, all right, for the short story. Jesus confronts people, self-righteous people, who despise others. That is their characteristic that shows up in their public life. Verse 9, he spake this parable unto certain. So there's not really a specific named person. He's not even necessarily talking to a group of Pharisees. I think there are Pharisees there, but there's more than Pharisees there. And a lot of people, even that followed Jesus, that weren't Pharisees or Sadducees or in the elite religious class, a lot of them were self-righteous too. See, a poor person can be just as self-righteous as a rich person. And we can look at a rich person driving by in a nice car and think, well, I'm better than them because I don't have all that. They take it for granted. You know, the great Western prophet John Denver was singing about thanking God. He was a country boy, and he said, I see city folk driving in a black limousine, and a lot of sad people think, that's mighty keen. And then he says, friends, let me tell you exactly what I mean. This is the song I always sing when I make pancakes, all right? Thank God I'm a country boy. As if it's wrong to ride in a limousine, like it's some kind of a virtue to have a beat-up pickup truck instead of a limousine, right? So we can all play that game, rich and poor alike. Some of you want me to sing that, and you will regret it if I do. All right, so Jesus confronts, though, a group of self-righteous people who despised others. Here's the root of the problem. We've discussed it already. What's the root of the problem? They trusted in themselves. All right? So we've discussed that in length. That is self-righteousness. They trusted in themselves that what? That they were righteous. That they were good. That other people were worse than them. And so that's what leads to this fruit in their life. They despised others. They despised others. Treated them with contempt. And I don't know how that would play out exactly in every person's life, but it would play out in the life of a Pharisee named Simon that we talked about this morning when Jesus was dining at his house, and this lady came in and broke the alabaster box anointed his feet, and was weeping and wiping his feet with her hair. She was so broken up about her sin and so thankful for his forgiveness. And that Pharisee said in his heart, if he was a real prophet, he'd know that this woman is a sinner. Well, aren't we all? But he didn't think he was. And so a self-righteous person will despise others. They will find someone they can look down on. You ever found someone you can look down on? Oh, come on now. All right? You maybe can see exactly what's wrong with them. Think about this publican for a minute. Look at what the Pharisee says. He says, I thank thee that I'm not as other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even, and he's looking around as he prays and he sees that guy, even this publican. Think about what a publican was. You guys are like, yeah, he worked for the IRS. Now, he was worse than that, all right? A publican was a tax collector, and he would buy a franchise from Rome. And so he was tasked from the Roman government with collecting X amount of denarii, X amount of money. And as long as he turned in the right amount of money to them, they didn't care what else he did. And so what he would do is he would collect a lot more than what was necessary. And he would, if you didn't pay up, he might hire some unsavory characters to come by your house and rough you up until you paid up. This is the kind of guy he was. If he was running for office in America today, the publican, if he was running for president, the opposing candidate would lead chants saying, "Lock him up." And all the Christians would chant with them because he was that corrupt. Right? So was that other one. He was that corrupt. You wouldn't vote for him, and I wouldn't vote for him. And we would want to see him locked up. And so here's the Pharisee, and he's praying. He looks around and sees that guy. Thank God I'm not like him. All right? Can you look down on someone like that? I can. All right? I can do it. I can look down with hatred and despise them and think that I'm better than them. But that is what self-righteousness produces in our hearts. I'm not saying that if you've ever looked down on someone that you're not a Christian. But it is just the attitude of self-righteousness that does that. See, self-righteousness forgets. It happens in a Christian. We forget that we were forgiven for so much. Our sins stink just as bad as their sins. The difference is ours are covered by the blood of Christ, and they need to hear the message too. That is the problem. That is the fruit of self-righteousness. It causes us to treat others with contempt and to despise others. All right? Here's another fruit of self-righteousness, and I can smell the food, so I need to move on here. Here's the short story. The fruit of self-righteousness will cause you to deceive yourself. That's what self-righteousness leads to: delusion. Self-delusion. We deceive ourselves in self-righteousness. Here's the short story. And the short story is not about the publican, although he features prominently. The short story that Jesus is going to tell is about the self-righteous person, because who is he talking to? He's talking to self-righteous people. So it's about the Pharisee, all right? And so two men go to pray. Here's the short story in verse 10. Two men go to pray. The one's a Pharisee, the other's a publican, a tax collector. Everybody knows who those people are. The Pharisee's delusion is demonstrated. He's a self-deceived man. And this is demonstrated by his self-exalting prayer. He almost broke his arm off patting himself on the back while he's praying, all right? And look at verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. In other words, he's standing by himself. He's gotten away from where the riffraff are. All right? Or is, I'm not sure. Anyway, and he is going to, as their habits would be, the Pharisees would stand as close as they could to the most holy place in the temple. And that's where he's going to go and stand. He can't go in because only the priest can go in there. It's got to be the high priest. But he's going to stand as close as he can. And this is kind of a posture of saying, I deserve to stand this close because of who I am. And he stands there. Look at this. In verse 11, he stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are. He's deluded by a false humility. This man thinks he's humble. You know that? The way to be proud is to be really convinced that you're humble. That's the problem with humility. It's one of those hard to grasp virtues. The moment you think you have it, you just lost it. Right? And so here's the Pharisee in his false humility, and he somehow brings the grace of God into this. God, I thank you that I'm so good. All right? See how that sounds kind of humble? Like, God, you made me this good. Good thing I am who I am. I know it's all of you, but man, I'm good. All right? He's deceived by a false humility. That is what self-righteousness will do. People don't walk around and say, man, I'm proud. Now they do have pride parades and things like that, and they exalt pride. The world does. But people still don't go around and in conversations, man, I'm just proud of myself. Because that just bothers people. But they believe They're humble. The Pharisees' delusion was demonstrated by he's deluded here by false humility in his prayer. And then look at his prayer again. He's deluded by selective comparison, a false comparison. Look at who he compares himself to. I'm glad I'm not as other people are. Extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even this publican. You talk to someone who's self-righteous and they'll be like, well, I haven't done really anything too bad. I haven't killed anybody. You know? People will throw that out there. I haven't killed anybody yet. Well, is that the only sin? That seems to be the only sin, killing people. And I mean, I'm not downplaying that, but that seems to be the only one that anybody thinks counts. And he's found somebody that's way worse than him, and he can make a comparison. You know what? If you're going to compare yourself to people, find someone better than you. All right? That's a great exercise. Find someone that is more godly than you and follow their example. Paul told the Corinthians to follow him as he followed Christ. Follow godly examples. And so he's deluded by a false or selective comparison, and then he's deluded by a false standard of righteousness. In verse 12, he says, I fast twice in the week, and I give tithes of all that I possess. Now, for sake of time, I'm not going to go back into Leviticus with you here, but in Leviticus, the Bible teaches and the law taught that there was one required fast every year for Jewish people, and that was the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, they would afflict their souls. They would have a solemn fast. That was one required fast. Every other fast was voluntary. All right? And so look what he says. I fast not once a year. I fast twice a week. They would do that conveniently on Tuesday and Thursday. Those were the market days in Jerusalem. And if you fasted on Tuesday and Thursday, you could put dust and ashes on your face and walk through the biggest crowd so more people could see you fasting. Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 6, when you fast, anoint your face. In other words, comb your hair, make yourself up, brush your teeth. Don't look like you're fasting. That's what Jesus said to them. Because why? They were doing the opposite. See, the Pharisees looked at fasting as an opportunity to proclaim their own spirituality to everybody. And so they're deluded by a false standard of righteousness. They're saying, well, if I fast twice a week and I give tithes of everything that I own, I do these things, and so I'm good enough for God. Here's what I don't do. I'm not like those guys. Here's what I do. I'm pretty good. Jesus would say in Matthew 23 and verse 23, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! Ye pay tithe on mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the others undone. You see, it's harder to measure. It's easy to measure 10%. That's pretty easy to figure. Don't even need a calculator. Just got to move the zero over, right? Okay? It's harder to measure judgment, mercy, and faith. Those things can't really be, it's harder to check that off on a checklist. And see, they had changed. Judgment, mercy, and faith requires daily humbling your heart before God and searching your soul, like David would say, and say, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. He would say that, and he would say, search me, O God, and try me and know my thoughts. And David would pray those prayers. The Pharisees didn't want that. They could check off a tithe, and they could check off a fast, and all of those things. They had a false sense of righteousness. Now, he's deluded, and that's demonstrated by self-exalting prayer. Now, his delusion is also rebuked here by a humble and faithful prayer. Here's the the publican, standing afar off, verse 13. So he's not standing right by the holy place. He's standing further away. And he would not lift up so much his eyes to heaven, but smote on his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He's look at the contrast here. The contrast with true humility in addressing God. And a contrast in humility in requesting mercy. Here the Pharisee made no request. Why is he praying? He's not asking for anything. Why pray if you're not going to ask, right? He's only praying to tell God how good he is. The publican is declaring his sin and begging for mercy. And so the Pharisee's delusion is rebuked by this humble, faithful prayer, and then it's rebuked by the results of the prayer. Jesus says in verse 14, I tell you that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Now, Jesus is talking about salvation here. This is not someone backslid or anything like that. This is one man gets saved, he's justified by God, the other man is damned. All right? It's life and death here. But God accepted the justified the publican as righteous and rejected the Pharisee. And that's the short story. Here's the timeless truth. The timeless truth is this. Everyone who exalts himself is going to be humbled. Look at it here. He says, for everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Whoever builds himself up, pats himself on the back. Whoever is proud of himself will be humbled. When? When? In the judgment. Be humbled before God. But the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Self-righteousness ends where humility begins, true humility. Self-righteousness ends on bended knee before the cross. And so this evening, as we close this up, as we wrap up, the humble brag story here, the story of two men, really, but one, the Pharisee, we examine ourselves. I don't think it is unhealthy for a Christian to examine their salvation. Just think about it for a second. Is your experience, is your salvation self-righteous? Have you truly turned to Jesus Christ and trusted in Him for His righteousness? Or are you just trusting in being Baptist? You're just trusting in maybe I'm good enough. It's never wrong, really, to examine your salvation. The book of 1 John is written for that. Paul said, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. And then the second part of this is self-righteous and sanctification. Do I look at others and think they're not as good as me? You know what? I think the best way that we can think about others, or the best way we can think about our relationship to others is whenever I walk into a room, I know who the worst sinner in the room is. It's me. I know whose sins are the most offensive to God. They're mine. And then I can live every day in forgiveness for those sins. It gives me a burden for the lost. And it gives me the right disposition towards others. And see, when I lose sight of that, then I can get to the place where I despise others in self-righteousness. Let's stand together.